Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Samara Jones, and I'm here to speak to you today out from a European perspective about Housing First. So if you just give me a moment, I'll share my screen. All right. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. It's an honor and a privilege, and I don't say that lightly. I admire the work that Turning Point has been doing on Housing First, as well as on other issues as well, and really look more and more to Scotland for great ideas, inspiration, and commitment to respecting the principles and the core values of Housing First. So it's really exciting to be here today, and I've caught some bits and pieces this morning, so thank you very much for this chance. Let me make sure this is working. Next slide. So I was asked to bring a bit of a perspective from outside to talk about the work of the Housing First Europe hub in Europe, and it's in a way it's sort of an outside report, but you as Turning Point Scotland are really a core part of the Housing First Europe hub. So it's also a bit me reporting to you as colleagues in this network. So just off the top, what we know about Housing First, and how does that what's the impact of that knowledge and that understanding in Europe? Well, what we know is, and what you know, is that Housing First makes sense and that it works. And we know it can have a significant impact when it's scaled up, and that Housing First can be a lever to reforming systems and really pushing to ending homelessness. I was speaking to a colleague this morning about how, if we think back, 10 years ago, talking about ending homelessness, talking about having an impact and a solution to homelessness, these were things that were almost controversial at the time. Almost, Housing First itself wasn't yet an accepted approach and practice. And the final point I have here is that the Housing First principles, they matter. That I really appreciate the title of the conference, that the non-negotiables is something that we have to be constantly reflecting on, because I think there is a push when people are starting Housing First or delivering Housing First to say, well, maybe some of those principles we don't quite need them, or could we go, put more emphasis on this principle first and they deal with those ones later? But they all matter, and that fidelity to the model is very important. And the example that you said at Turning Point is one that we all strive to follow elsewhere in Europe. So who are we? And when I say we, again, I want to include you, because the Housing First Europe Hub is a network that was kicked off in 2016 as a joint venture between FEANSA, which is the European Network of Homeless Organizations, and Y Foundation, which some of you are probably aware of is one of the champions of Housing First and the leader in Finland. And so following the sort of successful completion of the Housing First Europe Guide, this sort of project that brought a lot of organizations together, including Turning Point, they said, okay, what next? What's the next step that we need to take in order to really put in practice this idea that Housing First can have an impact to ending homelessness? And to have that impact, we need to scale up. Well, in order to do that, we needed to create a network of the people and organizations and governments and cities who were already interested in and committed to this idea. So we launched the idea, and we had about 15 founding partners who joined us to create this network, to decide what it is that we were actually going to do, and how was it that we were going to try and achieve these goals of scaling up Housing First, supporting the delivery of Housing First, and really raising awareness of how you can introduce this in a broader approach rather than just as a sort of standalone discrete project on homelessness. And so, as you'll see, you should recognize some of the names there. We've got two very important partners from Scotland: Turning Point, Rock Trust. But we also have bigger organizations that cover bigger territories. So we've got a national network from Italy. We have Housing First England. We have Crisis. We have a network of service providers from Sweden, Focus Ireland. And we also have other organizations and partners that are associations to the hub that weren't necessarily there at the very, very beginning, but have joined us along the way. What's crucial for us is that it's a diversity of partners. So it's not just organizations, it's organizations and cities like the city of Lyon, housing providers like Y Foundation, as well as a housing provider from Lyon, as well as ministries. We have a Ministry of Social Affairs from Belgium, from Denmark, and the ministry responsible for homelessness and housing in France. And our goal is to promote and support the scaling up of Housing First to end homelessness. And we do this through sharing learning and knowledge. And so our goal was to create this network in which everybody, I mean, it's a big ambition, but everybody could feel that they could honestly and openly share and exchange ideas. Because what we've seen, and I think you've seen also in your work, is that putting Housing First into practice, whether you're a frontline worker, a manager, administrator, a city administrator, or a housing provider, there are challenges along the way, but these are challenges that we can overcome by talking to each other, by seeing what we can maybe learn from others in other cities and other countries, and also by being honest about how we can do this. All right, next slide. Sorry. Oh, and the main things that we focus on are research, training, advocacy, and practice. So our work. I want to talk about two particular things. However, I have a very small household thing to attend to. I have to open the door for my son who's just come home from school. One moment, he doesn't have a key. Please bear with me for less than a minute. Hello, sorry. The joys of working from home in a pandemic where children get to go to school and then come home at the end of their half day. Sorry about that. So now that you've had time to read the slide, I can talk about two pieces I wanted to focus on in our work. One of the things that when we started out that we thought would be the most effective way to start building these networks and building these connections around Housing First, as well as making sure that there is a really good understanding of what Housing First is, was to establish a Train the Trainer program. And so drawing on the knowledge about Housing First, about the training that had already been developed on Housing First, we built a program that takes about a year with 3 sessions where ideally people come together in the same place at the same time for 2 or 3 days at a time to really look at the Housing First Europe guide and think about how they can teach that to a number of different audiences: housing providers, frontline workers, politicians. So one of our very first things was to establish this program, and we can now look back through, after we've run this program 3 times, and we've had 3 cohorts of trainers, some of course from Turning Point Scotland, and we can see a clear impact. We see that we have over 60 trainers from 15 countries and in 15 languages. And we see that their network for learning and sharing has actually very much helped for all of those trainers on an individual level, but also for our understanding of what's needed in terms of training as a whole. So that's a very key piece of our work, and I think we're delighted to be able to see how it continues to reinforce our work, but you'll see it too in your own training academy, and how your trainers can continue to learn from their colleagues across Europe, as well as even our trainers who came over from Australia to train with us. Another piece of work I wanted to highlight was our work on Housing First for Youth. And this is something I wanted to sort of spotlight as an innovation in Housing First. So we, as a hub, we supported the Rock Trust in West Lothian to develop and run a pilot project on Housing First for Youth. So we had been thinking about, how do you adapt the model? How do you make sure that Housing First can work for young people? What are the different needs of young people in terms of the supports that they might need, in terms of youth development, that transition from young person to adult? We ran the pilot project for 2 years, and we recently published in the autumn an evaluation. And it actually is very positive, the results. It was a smaller group to start with, quite a small group, but the results are consistently positive around tenancy sustainment, which is one of the key findings, of course, but also about the relationships, about the health and well-being, particularly of the young people. But you also had some very positive feedback from the Housing First for Youth staff as well, around meaningful activity, and as well as fidelity to the Housing First for Youth model. And it's really exciting to see how this pilot project is now being picked up and scaled up in Edinburgh. We also have projects in Ireland, which were sort of preceded this pilot project, but have learned a lot through being involved in training with this pilot project. We've also seen, again, across to France, where France has now, as a result of being involved in the hub, seeing this Housing First for Youth pilot project, they have developed 2 pilot projects in Lille and in Toulouse, with 50 young people in each city. And they hope that this will be the basis for scaling up the Housing First for Youth approach across the country in France. Speaking of France, I did want to bring a snapshot from outside Europe, outside of Scotland, to tell you a little bit about what's going on in the rest of Europe. For a more comprehensive look, we published a report back in 2019, trying to see what is the state of Housing First in Europe. And it was, to be honest, it was more of a challenge than I expected. I was hoping for sort of like a very clear and concise report of everything in every country, but the data is always less easy to compare than I would hope. And what we did get was a really interesting look at what's going on in different countries, even if it's not as easy to put into tables and charts as I would have hoped. But what we see is that there are clearly some countries where Housing First is part of a strategic approach to dealing with homelessness. It's part of an idea that we can reduce and end homelessness. In other countries, we see that Housing First is just, you know, one of many approaches, one of many types of projects. So in our work, we're quite keen on how do we help those projects become advocates for a scaled up approach to Housing First, and how can we support everybody to make sure that they're delivering Housing First that it respects the principles and the model. So I wanted to highlight France because this is a country where they've done a national experimentation project several years ago in 4 cities. And that experimentation project gave them a very important evidence base. And as you know, Housing First, I think, is the only approach to homelessness that has been so well studied. And yet we still have to keep proving it. But we have a fantastic evidence base for Housing First. And it was very valuable to have this French experimentation project, because from that, they have decided to build a national rollout of Housing First. They've done it in a couple of phases. They are also following very much a Housing First for people who need it, and a housing-led or rapid rehousing approach for people who don't necessarily need the intensive support. And I mean, it's not without its struggles. It's a big country. But what's interesting is how they've organized the rollout. So they have some support at national level, but they've really handed back the autonomy to each city to develop its own plan and its own approach, taking into account the local context, the local actors. And in Lyon, which is a city in sort of middle southern France, it's been really interesting to see how, as this rollout was starting, Lyon as a city decided to join the Housing First Europe hub with the local authority and a housing provider. So they came together to the hub, and they've told us often, sort of anecdotally, how important it has been for them to be involved in a broader network as they've developed their local plan. And their local plan is now very ambitious, and it is actually been made more ambitious because of the pandemic. They're using this moment of seeing of more people seeing the absolute need for people to have housing in order to be safe and healthy. And so they've set themselves a very ambitious plan, as you can see, to reduce homelessness by half, ensure young people leaving state care have access to housing immediately upon discharge. And they're focusing on increasing the supply of affordable and decent housing, and looking at how can they integrate the Housing First principles across the board. And this is, so it's fascinating to watch and to hopefully bring them some examples from around Europe for how they can help to deliver this. I also wanted to highlight maybe the other end of the spectrum, where in Central and Eastern Europe, you don't see the same strategic and systems approach to using Housing First. But you see some incredible enthusiasm and drive from some providers, some housing providers, some local organizations that are really trying to break through some very difficult conditions to establish Housing First. So I've put the two examples here of Poland, where they've both struggle against a lack of housing supply. These are countries that have a very low vacancy rate in general, and have a tiny rental market, let alone a social or a housing association market. So they really struggle with how do they access the housing. They're also struggling to convince local authorities. But what's been interesting to see is that speaking to colleagues in both countries, that the frontline staff and the managers are very enthusiastic, and they are looking for support to try and convince their local authorities, trying to find housing. And so it's exciting to work with them, even though they face quite a number of obstacles. And just to talk about Finland, because I think it still remains an absolutely exciting example of where, by putting their mind to reducing and ending homelessness with Housing First at the core of their approach, they've absolutely succeeded in doing that. And they've done that by increasing the supply of housing, of affordable social housing for people who need Housing First, but also for people who need rapid rehousing or just social housing, affordable housing. And because they've had a political commitment that hasn't just been for a 4-year mandate of one government. This is a political commitment that is now rolling into, I think its third or fourth government mandate. And that means that there has been sustained funding, both in terms of making sure that individuals have access to housing benefits that then can pay the rent, but also that the services that are delivered, they have really succeeded in moving away from this idea that funding is in 1-year blocks or 18-month blocks. And I think that that's something that we can all learn from as well. But it has also been a challenge for them. It didn't happen overnight, and I think that's important for us to all reflect on, that it took time to well, in that case, in their case, it took time to bring the workforce on board. There were my colleagues from Finland talk about how social workers would say, "Well, that's never going to work. That's never going to work," and they sometimes resisted the push from central government to change. But what they've managed to do over the course of the past 8 years is to really create a network, a learning network across the country on Housing First that meets consistently, that brings these difficult questions and challenges together in an open forum, and that they have this commitment to learning from each other and to learning from outside. So here's a country that's like arguably the leader in Housing First as a systemic approach in Europe, and they are constantly looking elsewhere to see how can we improve, what lessons can we take from Scotland or from France or from Denmark. So I think that ethos of learning and growing and continually developing is something that is helping their success. And I'm not sure where I am on my time, but I just wanted to say a little bit about you, about Turning Point, about Scotland, about you as leaders, and how important that is for us outside of Scotland to be able to call on you for your very specific expertise on the principles and on fidelity. I remember when I first came to Housing First, my struggles to understand, what is fidelity? Why is it so important? And now I think you will find me an ardent supporter and cheerleader. But I was also in working with colleagues at Turning Point, able to learn how to articulate that and how to help bring other people along as well. And I think that is your focus on training, on peer work, and on linking those with your advocacy and policy work is really crucial. And it's just, for me, it's very exciting, and I've learned so much. And I really wish I could be there all in one room with everybody, but that will have to wait for another year, I guess. And I wanted to comment on how important that's been for us as a hub, and to be able to work with different individuals in Turning Point and to be able to create things together. Your sort of enthusiasm for learning and sharing, I put it here on the slide, it is contagious. So when we work together, you just sort of bring this ethos of how can we build something together and learn from each other. And then this final one is something that I think is also really important, and something I've taken on, is the commitment to the core principles and fidelity, but also this commitment to reflection on, are we doing what we want to be doing? Are we doing what we should be doing? And are we doing it well? And being able to take that time and reflection to look back at our own work, as well as looking forward, rather than just saying, okay, what's the next thing? And we're not nearly as far along as you guys are with 10 years. That's really a fantastic achievement. But we are at 4.5 years, almost 5 years. And for us, I think it's also a moment in the hub to think about how we can continue in our own mission to support this scaling up, working on these different tracks of, helping to provide and share expertise for people who are new to Housing First, so maybe countries from Eastern Europe or cities where they haven't tried Housing First at all yet, to also being able to support with our trainers, who then can go out and teach at different levels and to different audiences, but also really to maintain this focus on advocacy and being able to articulate how systems can change, how we can change this approach to homelessness, that it doesn't need to be an emergency response, that we can really build in Housing First as a sustainable way to address the issue of homelessness, and hopefully end up at reducing the numbers of people who find themselves homeless, and hopefully get to a stage where we can prevent it so that people will have access to their home and support before they even need to fall into a phase of homelessness. So it's a little bit disconcerting because I can't see anybody on the screen, but I hope that I've touched on some useful things here, and I'd be very happy to take some questions. I'm also happy to keep talking if that's what you would like. So thank you. Oh, I think you're muted. I can't hear you. Sorry, Nikki.
Apologies for that.
That's great. Thanks.
The questions that are coming up, I was just saying thank you for the presentation. There's some questions coming up. So yeah, Denmark is said to be a housing first success, but famously has ghettos and discriminatory policies on housing for people of migratory backgrounds. How does Housing First reconcile this?
Okay, it's a very good question, and I'm not an expert on the Danish situation. However, I know that the question of migrants and migration around Housing First is an issue that for some countries is a huge issue. And in Denmark, I know that they work with homeless migrants, and people who are in the system are treated with have equal rights. I really don't know how it works with in terms of what you say about the ghettos and the discrimination. I don't know about that. That's a question I think I will put to our Danish partners, but I would flip that question a little bit to the French situation, which I know a little bit more about. The example I was talking about in Lyon, they are sort of pioneers in France in the sense that their plan also involves dealing with this difficult question of people who are living in France, in Lyon, but don't have rights. They don't have recourse to public measure, and they will include them in their Housing First approach. And so this is something quite new, and it's quite interesting for us to see what how they're going to do that. But I will definitely put that question to Danish colleagues to answer, and I can get back to you on that. It's a theme that we haven't looked at specifically in the hub, but it's one that I think we should deal with.
There's another question here. In the Netherlands, we have a great deal of shortage of homes. Is this recognisable in Scotland, and how have you tackled the challenge? I'm not sure if you're going to be able to answer that question, but I just thought it was an interesting one to ask.
Well, I know in Scotland that you've worked really, at any event I've been at, that I think it's been really interesting how you've always invited local authorities, housing providers, housing associations, and that building those relationships is maybe a long process, but it's something that does take time, and I think it can be successful when you are you in not constant contact, but when you're learning together. So I've been to some of the Connect meetings that were organized as part of the recent sort of strategy project. I've also been to some other broader conferences, and that at every table there would always be people from the different actors around the same table. And I think starting those relationships, not being afraid to knock on the door of a housing provider and say, okay, you might be wary of Housing First, but here are some things that I can bring to you to tell you, that it will work. You will have support. So I think that's one thing. The example I can give that I know from Scotland is from Housing First for Youth, where Rock Trust worked very closely with Almond Housing Association. And what they did was they made sure that, Almond was up for the project, got involved, and they made sure that their housing officers went on the same training as the Housing First for Youth workers. So they got the same level of training. They understood what the concept was. They understood what the staff were planning to deliver in terms of support. And I have to say that after being involved in the pilot project, they are one of the best advocates for Housing First for Youth, because they can speak to it from the perspective of a housing provider, saying, you know, at least in the context of Scotland, these are young people who would be in our housing anyways, and who have support needs. And at least with Housing First for Youth, we know that for sure they're going to receive the support that they need. So I mean, I can't answer for the rest of Scotland, but I could answer on that one particular example.
There's a question here that I find quite interesting as well, that is there existing research in the incorporation of health and social care specialists into the Housing First model? And would there be scope for this?
I think in terms of research, I'm not sure. I'll take a look, but I know that in the Finnish model that is absolutely the case. So in Finland, there are organizations that that deliver healthcare and social care, who are now, you know, several years on from Housing First starting up in Finland, who are very well versed in the principles, the core principles of Housing First, and who, when they work with, when people, I'll just give an anecdote, probably that's better because I don't have any data, I can give an anecdote instead. So I met a director of, it's basically, I think, a long-term care facility for people with health needs who would have been homeless if they weren't in Finland. So they live in their own apartment. It's a single unit. They have their own tenancy contract, but healthcare is provided to them because they need physical healthcare. And the director of that service, she was talking to me about it, and she just gave one example. She said, well, for example, we don't wear, I'm a doctor, but I don't wear a white coat when I'm there. We interact with people on a very sort of human and equal level. And the other example that was sort of the most telling to me was that she was taking one of the tenants, patients, out for a coffee. And so they go out for a coffee. I think she took him in his wheelchair, and they go to a local cafe, and they're sitting at the cafe. And the waiter comes up and takes their order and says, what would you and your father like to have? And she didn't flinch, she didn't blink, she didn't say, oh no, he's my patient. She just said, yeah, we'll have 2 coffees. So for her, it was that they were 2 people out for coffee, whether they were talking about his health needs or just having a conversation, that for her, she could see over the course of her career and applying these principles to her work, that it had really changed the nature of the relationship between the workers and the tenants, and that everybody had, you know, there had been challenges. She also had some stories about difficulties they had, but just that for them, it had been completely or absolutely possible to make this shift. It had taken time, but it had been possible. So I think Finland is a good example, and that's also where they've introduced in their social work training, and they're hoping to expand that out to healthcare professionals as well, courses on Housing First, courses on the principles, so that young students or older students are learning these principles as they're getting their education and their training. So that's one place that it's been very, very successful. Again, I keep coming back to France, sorry, but the French model for Housing First, it was run, the very first experimentation project was run through, partly through the Department of Health. So they ran it through with some support from nurses, psychiatric support as well. So they brought in health professionals as well as part of the teams of workers that they were being trained as Housing First workers. Portugal has also used this approach, where they've also brought a kind of more multidisciplinary team to deliver the support. And in that case, I think it's also, I don't know if it's always had the impact of sort of radiating back to the people not involved in that team, but you could see that maybe as an entry point. If somebody's involved in a multidisciplinary team, goes back to their home base and talks about the project. But I think more structural training of other sectors is really crucial to making this a systems-wide approach.
Thank you very much. There's maybe time for another few questions. There's one here first of all, asking about the age range of people for the Housing First Youth Scheme, but also there's a question about the key differences between Housing First and Housing First for Youth.
Mm-hmm. So the age range, I think it depends country to country, but in some cases, I think it's as low as 17. I think it's 17 because Scotland is one of the places where you can have a tenancy at quite a young age. So that's been part of it, is where can young people have a legal tenancy? So that's sort of the bottom range. And then the top range is up to at least 25, 26, 27, I think has sort of been the top range in the projects that we've seen. In terms of the main differences, it's very important to have a youth work approach when you're delivering the Housing First for Youth. So young people are in a very different stage of their development. So the people involved as Housing First for Youth workers need to be aware of that, need to be able to come from that perspective of development. There are some things that are tweaked a little bit in the model, and we have the model available on our website. For example, the network of support will be different because there will be could be education providers involved, schools involved. There's also more, as far as we've seen, connection or maybe earlier reconnection with family. There's a lot of parents who want to still be involved in their young person's life, and vice versa. But that kind of dynamic is something that you wouldn't necessarily see in adult Housing First. So in the sense that we've not changed the model dramatically, but we've adapted the principles to make sure that it makes sense for young people. The other thing that's important to think about for Housing First for Youth is that young people are much less likely to want to stay in that first apartment that they might be in Housing First for Youth for, upwards of 5 or 10 years. So the Housing First for Youth, the support moves with that young person should they wish to or need to choose to move homes. And that's something that I think is important, that constancy of support is crucial. And for many of the young people, or all of the young people involved in Housing First for Youth, that's something that's probably been absent in their lives up to the stage that they're at.
Thank you very much. Another question here, possibly the last one for the sections, I'm not sure. Are there any efforts to receive political buy-in at the European Union level of governance?
Yes. I wanted to say that despite Brexit, we're still working very closely with EU staff and Scotland. So in terms of European developments, for the first time ever, we think, we know, there's going to be a European platform on homelessness that's going to be launched sort of as a political collaboration platform for political leaders from all of the different European countries. And as part of that, we at the Hub and with FEANZA are working hard to promote and suggest that, that Housing First needs to play a really important role in terms of what programs or what a policy to end and reduce homelessness would look like. And so, so it's actually quite an exciting time on the EU, on the EU level at the moment. And this platform should launch in June under the Portuguese presidency, and hopefully it will be an opportunity to really bring that level of decision maker and politician together. I think that Housing First, as you all know, is something that's quite it's not so hard to explain. It makes sense. It's common sense to people, and I think it might be something that politicians at that level can understand and get behind, and hopefully then now we sort of have all the pieces in place for how to develop and design a good Housing First approach, and so hopefully we'll get an opportunity to work with them on that.
Many thanks. I'm just looking at the time and wondering if we've got enough time for another question. Just having a look here. Yeah, some of the challenges in setting up and managing a community of practice across Europe. Yes.
First challenge is language, because there's a lot of people who speak good English, so that's great, but that's not always the case. And that's been our biggest challenge, is how do we develop those networks so that everyone has an ability to communicate and ask their questions and bring their experience. So that's been a challenge for us. Partly we've been able to deal with that a bit through the training. So the training, our Train the Trainer program, we deliver training in English, but then people go back to their own communities and can deliver training and create networks in their own languages. But we're trying, and we're finding, I have to say, I mean, nobody is happy about the pandemic, but some of the positive spin is that we have been doing more and more of these online events, which in some ways has lowered the barrier for people to attend, even if English is not a language that they feel particularly strong in, because you can participate a bit more passively. You don't have to like take 2 days off of work to come to something, and you can watch it back afterwards and maybe sort of slow it down so that you can make sure you've caught everything. So I think that those communities of practice, we're really putting an emphasis on them now, because we know there's a lot of interesting innovations that have actually developed, in this past year, unfortunately due to the pandemic, and we want to make sure that we can share them in different countries as well. So not just at an English speaking level, but also amongst colleagues in different languages. But yeah, it's a big one. Bringing people together in person is great, but it's also really expensive. So that's something like we want to be able to do, but yeah, budgets make that more difficult. But we think it's really important, and we're definitely committed to trying to make it work as best we can.
Again, thank you very, very much. And I think we're just about right on the timing for going for a lunchtime break now. That's my understanding anyway. We're going to stop for a little while just now and then get back together for about 1:30. Hope that sounds okay for everybody. Get back together at that time. Many thanks again.
Thank you. Thank you so much for the opportunity. And yeah, I hope next year that we can all get together in person. And for all of you, keep up the excellent work and keep telling us about it, because we use it as examples all over the place. So thank you again.